Unfortunately, I haven't had an opportunity to read the book yet, but I will do so. But I did have a chance to hear Anthony make a presentation in London at the LSE earlier this year, and I was impressed by what he had to say, as I'm impressed by what the two speakers have said today. They make a lot of sense. I don't agree with 110% of everything they say, but 99.9 I think I do.
That's a very good score.
I want to underscore a few points that they made so that they won't be forgotten by our audience. One is the tripartite nature of politics in Rakhine State. This goes back a long, long time, beyond earlier than they were talking about. But as early as 1945, at the end of the Second World War, there arose in Rakhine State a separate communist party, a separatist Buddhist movement, which was very antagonistic towards the center of the country at that time. At the same time, in the same area, a Mujahideen movement got developed, which became armed, which was fighting against the British Army initially, and then against the Burmese Army, to establish East Pakistan as part of Buthidaung and Maung. In other words, to move that out of Myanmar and make it part of East Pakistan. That, of course, that movement failed, as did the communists. But they all persisted underneath the surface of politics into at least the late 1980s. Bit of anecdote, if I may. I lived in Myanmar in 1978, during the first of the crises we've talked about, that Anthony put on the chart. It was quite fascinating in those days. I received my monthly stipend from the Australian Embassy. I was an Australian citizen at that time. And I went to the embassy and asked them, I've read in the newspapers about the Rakhine crisis and these hundreds of thousands of people who fled to then Bangladesh. What can you tell me about it? We don't know any more that's in the newspaper. And we asked the Ministry of Foreign Affairs what they know about it. And they said, we don't know any more about it than what's in the newspaper. In other words, the issue wasn't politicized at that time, either domestically or internationally. It had its domestic roots in tensions, and it grew out of the pressure by the Department of Immigration to check on people's citizenship privileges, not only in Rakhine State, but in the north of the country as well, because infiltration from China as well from Bangladesh became issues in Myanmar politics at that time, as they've been subsequently. The same in 1991-92, the second crisis. I was living in Yangon at that time. It didn't become internationalized, or didn't become politicized domestically. It was dealt with basically as something the Army would deal with, and the Army government would deal with at that time, just as General Ne Win dealt with it in 1978. And in 1978, and again in 1992, agreements were reached between the Bangladesh government and the Myanmar government to have them return, and most of them did, if they could demonstrate that they had some knowledge of the village that they claimed to have come from. So there was give and take at that time because it didn't become politicized, internationally or domestically. This is no longer the case, of course, when we get to the last 10 years or so. It's become highly politicized. I visited these two areas, Maung and Buthidaung, the only one time in my life, in 2006. It's the poorest part of Myanmar I've ever been to. I've traveled to every state and division in Myanmar at one time or another since 1975. It's probably the poorest place I've ever seen. Public facilities, roads, there were no roads. Motor vehicles, we hired the only Jeep in town. There was nothing. Quite desperate situations, and people were very desperately poor. When you went about and talked to people, you asked them what the Rohingya were, because what we knew about this. People said, we don't know, we don't know. You asked them, Balumiole, with Burmese, for what's your ethnicity? Muslim. They said, we're Muslims. Of course, it's not an ethnicity, it's a religion. But then the movement got politicized, and the growth of the international Rohingya movement since that time has been quite important in creating the kind of crisis situation which exists today. I could go on about this, but I think that's enough been said by our two previous speakers to talk about. One of the reasons I endorse their book is because so much rubbish has been written about this issue. And talk about fake news, there's tons of fake news. And it's quite remarkable how quickly, though, fake news on Myanmar issues can be picked up and become popularized, and it's hard to fight against it. So a book like theirs is fighting against a wall of ignorance and prejudice which has to be cut down. And thank goodness they propose some solutions, because no one has any solutions. As they point out, there's no short-term solution, there's only long-term solutions. Now, I actually have a solution to the problem, but no one will listen to me. My solution is that the British government humbly go to the United Nations and to the government of Myanmar, and to the government of Bangladesh, and say, look, chaps, we made a mistake. In 1948, when we gave you the map of Myanmar, we drew the border wrong. Buthidaung and Maung should be part of Bangladesh, or at least Pakistan. As part of the northern border should be part of China. And then Myanmar's many problems will be solved. Just redraw the map. But of course, that's no longer possible. Now Myanmar is a democracy. And no democratic government can say we're going to yield an inch of our sovereign territory. And remember, when this crisis first came on the Chinese border, after President Thein Sein was elected, he said, we will fight for every inch of our country and defend our sovereignty. General Ne Win used to say, there's nothing up there worth one of my soldiers' lives for. Nobody can say that anymore because Myanmar has become a democracy. Also, Islam and religion have become international issues in the last 10 years. And you can't forget that. And the context is completely different than how it was dealt with before. So their points are very useful. I'll stop at that point and turn over to my colleague Tin Mamang Than, who knows much more about this than I do.
Thank you, Rolf. And we might return to some of your points. Not sure about the UN proposal.
Well,
Tin.
Bob was my thesis supervisor 30 years ago, and we've come a long way since then. I would start at the back about resolution issues. I read somewhere in Scientific American that 60% of the cancers were random. So you can't find how it happens. And I think it's the same, I would say, in the Rakhine issue, when trying to find causal links. There are random events and unintended consequences. I would rather go for management or de-escalation than resolution if I were there. I hope I were never there. This is a very complicated, as I agree, everybody agrees. Only thing is, they agree and then started coming up with simple solutions. That's the international community, I'm sorry to say. Another thing is that, how do you term it? Protracted. A complex emergency, or if I may use an oxymoronic word, chronic emergency, because this emergency happened again and again. But labeling doesn't solve the problem, right? So I think you can have many approaches to it, and I think you have to be on the ground, do work, but it is very difficult, as you say. Sampling problems are there. Talk to whom, and would they tell you the truth? Of course not. Facts and truths, I believed them when I was young. Now I don't believe in facts and truths anymore, in a sense. Even in science. I came from physics. These issues are all collapsed into each other, and context is very important, and the context keeps changing. And so this is how, even when there's no point, I would say, to have a matrix or classification of that, I suppose. And then situations, it is very poignant when we talk about Rakhine, and I'm very, very glad that it was brought up that the ancient history and recent history are collapsed into now. That is the biggest problem. And also, there are so many myths that has to be busted. Remember the myth buster thing in the TV, I think. So there are more myths to be busted. I hope you carry on busting myths. And I think in the case of Rakhine issue, the Kofi Annan Commission is, I would say, a little bit, events have overtaken it, as I say. But at the moment, the government is trying to implement it as much as it can, and it has come up with 3 levels of commissions or committees to oversee it. Of course, the last one is, of course, investigation, which is part of the commission recommendations too. Yes, you have to go through them. But at the moment, the emphasis is now on repatriation. But it is becoming very difficult because of the politicization and internalization. In 1978, 1991, 92, it was easier because they were repatriated as so-called residents of Rakhine. Now, the conditions come with them. They will not come. I mean, it is fair to ask for security, to ask for homes that were destroyed. But beyond that, they now come with the agenda of wholesale citizenship for all of them. That's the ASA cry, which has been replicated by many of the so-called leaders in the camps, which is a no-win situation for both sides. It is, even repatriation would be affected if that is the case. And of course, it may take years and years. It takes several years even for 91, 92 to finish. So it will take years. Money will become, there will be other fashions, there will be other crises in the world, and international community is not a bottomless pit of money, and that's another problem. So humanitarian issues are collapsed again with issues of human rights, and then they are also collapsed again with the issue of nationhood. It's a very difficult for me to say so. And of course, we are all migrants. We came from Africa 200,000 years ago as Homo sapien. All women come from Miss Eve in Africa 170,000 years ago. DNA analysis. Men, they can't find it. I don't know why. So that should be kept in mind by all parties. Who comes first set the rules. But not necessarily the first, because in Burma, the first people are the Pew and the kind that they vanished. Their civilization vanished like a Mayan. I don't know where they went. So then there come the Burmese, the Shans, the Shan, the Thai. We have Laos, Cambodia, Mon Khmer. I mean, many of us are. How do you find a pure Burmese? I'm born in Mandalay. I'm supposed to be the pure Burmese. I don't think so, because I have relatives in the Shan state, in the Mon state as well. But that is besides the point, because facts are not the thing that governs people's decision making. Emotions and perceptions. And the government failure, I would say, is more or less that it sticks to facts too much, their own facts. Perceptions seem to be forgotten from both sides. And the nation state, Myanmar has never been a nation state, and it will probably never will be a nation state in the Westphalian sense. So nation and state, so what is happening is actually so-called state building, as Bob has said before. But in that state building, the issue of Rakhine itself was left behind in state building, if I may say so, even in state building. And that creates the Rakhine nation to rise again. And that complicates the situation with the so-called, or whatever you call Rohingyas or Bengalis. I believe in people's self-identification, but that is not possible now because it has become so politicized and legitimized. So if you call them Rohingya, that means giving them citizenship. That's what they think, the Burmans think. Delegitimize them by not calling them Rohingyas. So it became like the Burma-Myanmar thing of the 1990s and 2000. And that will not solve the problem. But I said, I don't have any hope of solving it within my lifetime, but managing it and not having it kind of consequences which are disastrous is the one that you can also hope for. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sayatin. So in a short while we might open it up to questions, but I'd just like to actually raise a point which makes me, having covered it extensively, that in some ways, not that it has direct bearing on the search for a solution, or it could possibly on the question you raised of urgency, but right now we've got this process going on. There's a big push for accountability, pressure in the UN Security Council, quite strong divisions between Security Council members over how to proceed or answer demands for accountability, and some raising this issue of ICC, the International Court jurisdiction or lack thereof. But so much is being made now in the Security Council to the level we hadn't seen before, because it's obviously a very hot potato for the Security Council, including because of Russia and China's steadfast opposition to any real censure of Myanmar. But what we've got now is this new narrative that it's all pinned on August the 26th as supposedly the date that this whole new conflagration happened. In fact, I mean, for those who have been covering it, and as you well know, it all happened in 2000 and 16 or 15. 12. No, but I meant this current thing, ASA's first appearance was late 2015, 16, October, with the attacks there. And that actually triggered the first big exodus. And we're talking about nearly 80,000 that fled in a panic then. But we saw extraordinary brutality then. But I think a lot of international media and even organisations and reports I've seen seem to take the whole thing as coming from August the 26th, 2017. So I think that kind of shapes it a little bit more, because there's almost, it's kind of been ignored that there was a lot of signs earlier on that the military had been, I mean, you know, they had moved in extra units. There was a lot of activity in Rakhine State that showed that there was some suspicion or expectation of new militancy amongst the Rohingya community, and also ASA's very appearance. But that really has been lost in the wash, so to speak. Do you think it makes a difference, that this timing? Because I know that we'll see a lot of media focus on August the 26th. There's a lot of conferences and panels about, you know, the anniversary of the Rohingya exodus. And in fact, technically the Rohingya exodus happened in, you know, some time before that.
And has been going on for decades.
Well, yes, that's true. But, you know, people need anniversaries. So August the 26th, 2017 has become the anniversary.
Yeah. Well, I was going to also point out, I mean, the 2014 regional refugee crisis was very much about Rohingya leaving in fairly large numbers back then. So this is not new. It's certainly not 2017, August 26th, no.
Yeah, the question is whether it makes a difference. But anyway, let's move on. The three, I think another point I wanted to make was the three really separate kind of issues that have converged in this whole crisis and saga, as you outlined it, and as both our discussants pointed out. One is the focus on repatriation and the urgency that you described as, you know, how urgent this is in terms of how long Bangladesh can hold it, how long you say the danger is that Rohingya lands will be, you know, confiscated. They already are. There's no question that Rohingya will go back to any land, or that any recognition will be made of prior claims. So that has been made clear even in the recent. The second separate issue is protection, and, you know, the provision of protection for returnees, but also I think in the camps. And finally, this accountability issue, which is sort of pulling the whole issue onto a separate track, where a lot of people want to put focus, money and energy on accountability and investigation when there is still this urgent humanitarian crisis. So I wonder if any of you could comment on this kind of fragmented response that to me looks pretty, you know, counterproductive actually, because there's a lot of energy, money and time being spent on different strands and not really any real focus on what to do, mainly because no one knows what to do perhaps, but I'll let you.
Can I start by addressing the last one, the question of accountability, and particularly the talk about referrals to the International Criminal Court, the ICC. In most conflicts, people that are referred to the ICC, that tends to happen as a transitional justice after there's been a resolution of some description or a solution, rather than before we've got any repatriation and solution or a deal or anything on the table. We're already talking about who to refer and how to refer them, which is only likely to actually lead those who fear they might possibly be named to not want to cooperate. Right. And I fear that they are completely counterproductive. There's a bit of apart from anything else, there's an ordering issue here about, you know, around conflict resolution and how you move forward. I think also there's, you know, you were talking before about you know, how central or peripheral the idea of history is, and about human rights, and how these issues have been a bit conflated. And I think that, you know, there's a big conflation here between human rights and citizenship rights. And I think there are two questions at play here. Absolutely guarantee, fundamentally important is the protection of human rights and the fact that there's been massive violation of human rights. That needs to be addressed. There is a separate, not unrelated, but a separate question, that needs resolution about citizenship rights. And I believe, personally, I believe that the Rohingya ought to be given citizenship on so many grounds, and that we go into some of those in the book. But they are separate issues, and I think we're doing harm by trying to conflate all of those at once into one set of issues. Who to refer to the ICC while we make sure that their human rights is protected, while we make sure that they get citizenship right now. I'm not sure that's actually helpful.
And repatriated.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, thank you. Bob, would you like to say something?
Well, just to underline those points, this strikes me as sort of the knee-jerk international reaction these days to a problem. Throw it in the hands of the UN, get the knee-jerk UN resolution about the issues that have to be dealt with, form a committee, and then it's solved, which is what the Myanmar government does as well. Form a committee and you solve the problem. And then we can all go home and have lunch. It doesn't really solve anything at all, but it makes people feel better, like passing resolutions and sanctions. We all feel better, we've done our bit. But it doesn't really solve anything. And the question of citizenship in Myanmar is, like in many countries, complex and highly politicized. And when you can make it a democracy, even more so. As we see in India, there are 4 million people allegedly, as I've read in the newspapers this week, denied their citizenship because they come from Bangladesh. They haven't claimed they're Rohingyas, they just say they're Bengalis, and therefore they're not citizens. Well, we had Israel. If you're not a Jew, you're not an Israeli. I mean, these are complex issues which are highly politicized. Only in the new states, like the United States or Australia or New Zealand, is citizenship and ethnicity not generally linked together. And states tie themselves in knots over ethnicity these days. And Tin's absolutely right that, until we stop talking about ethnicity and citizenship rights are the rights that bestowed by the state, made by Thomas Hobbes, the problem's never going to be resolved. And I fear this will never be resolved. J.S. Furnival once wrote in the 1950s, Burma has many problems, all of which are irresolvable. Well, certainly this one is, and there is no resolution. And we can try to ameliorate the conflict, find ways to assuage the problem. We can't necessarily, I don't necessarily completely with Gwen, that there can't be any repatriation and some land can't be made available, et cetera, et cetera. But given the population pressures of that part of the country and the poverty that exists today, just letting people come back is not a solution. There has to be economic development that's a solution. But economic development in that part of the world is very, very complex and very difficult. Particularly Myanmar is now becoming a place which is exploited for resources, but no one's investing. Why aren't they investing? For political reasons. So it's a circular problem. It goes on and on and on and on and on. And I've been studying Myanmar so long I start to get depressed. I've always been a historian. Basically I'm an optimistic guy. But as I lost my right eye, I started to say, well, maybe things are not going to get better. So anyway, sorry about that.
Thank you, Bob. Yes.
I would like to say two things. One on the question of accountability and the other one on the question of citizenship. I think that with accountability, the first question that we need to ask is why now and what is going to be the aim of that? Not only that, Anthony talked about transitional justice, but transitional justice doesn't necessarily entail retribution. So transitional justice is a fairly new concept over the past 20-25 years, which entails other understandings of justice rather than just retribution. So in that context, we need to think what kind of transitional justice we're looking for. And what is the scope of this transitional justice? What is the end product, if you like, what we are trying to achieve? To bring a few people in front of the ICC won't resolve the problem. It won't make things better. Either we do it now or later on if we have a smooth transition to a more peaceful environment. So the question is what we're looking for when we talk about accountability. And I think that they haven't thought through at the Security Council about what they are trying to achieve. Probably they react rather than being proactive in what they're going to do. With the question about citizenship, I think that essentially Myanmar is the microcosm of a major trend that now witness all over the world about the fast movement of population. And this is not only in Myanmar, it happens everywhere. So people move faster than any other time in human history. And therefore, we need to think about the qualities of citizenship. Who is going to be a member of the political community within what we call the territorial state? Should we be looking for ethnic characteristics that can qualify for political citizenship or territorial ones? Which means that whoever lives in a specific demarcated territory called Myanmar, called Russia, called whatever, they are members of this political community. Therefore, they have citizenship rights, and so on and so forth. Rather than trying to invent and reinvent ethnicities, it is important, and ethnic identity is important to all of us. But why it has to be so strongly associated with our political identity as citizens? So moving from an ethnic, if you like, characteristic of citizenship to a territorial understanding of citizenship, I think may be worthwhile for exploration.
Right.
The thing is getting more and more complicated because race and ethnicity has been also interchangeably used in this part of the world, not only Myanmar. As you know, race is actually, as a sociological and an anthropological concept, race is almost discredited. But it still rings true among corridors of power because it helps them. The most advanced nation among the Asia, the most advanced economic nation, still use the word race. I don't want to mention it. Okay. In the case of citizenship, the problem, as you say, is we are talking about ethnicities linked to citizenship or naturalization, territorial citizenship, or civic nationalism, or whatever you call it, in a sense. The question is, in nation building, if I may use the term state building, but it became nation building in the Burmese past, under the colonial rule, and then the so-called separate ruling of the country and so on. Nationalism was used as a leverage against the British and mobilization. And that nationalism, of course, once you open the Pandora box, never ends. Which is a nation? Among the so-called 135 ethnicities, or what they call national races, the use is national races, right? It's wrong, because some of them are dialects, some of them are just wrong dialects in the wrong place, sort of thing. But let us forget about it. I think it may be more than 200 and so on. It will become like infinite redux. And so this is another naughty problem, which again, as you say, conflated again with this Rohingya issue. It's not only Rohingya, it's also for the Shans, the Kachins, the Gorakhas, the Nepalis in Burma. They've been there for long, the Gorakhas. The guy is carrying a citizenship card. I met a Gorakha guy. But now they are feeling a little bit uneasy. The Muslims who are not Rohingyas, who do not call themselves Rohingyas, they are feeling very, very uneasy.
Right.
And localities become, prejudices come up, economic rivalry and all the things are used against these guys. And they can't move. They are legitimate people, they can move. But once they move, somebody reported and you are blocked. Nothing happens, of course, they are citizens, but it creates a kind of a sense of fear among the Muslims who are not Rohingyas. And that is also neglected by the international community, more or less. And the government also is so focused on this our problem that they also know about these things, but they cannot rectify them in due course. And it creates more and more problem in state building. And in democracy, and in the Facebook world, you can do almost anything. Of course, you can be sued if you put something on the Facebook nowadays and things, but that's another story. But the thing is, at this kind of, and people tend to believe, I don't know why people believe everything in the internet and Facebook, almost everything, including my wife. My wife especially is prone to these medical solutions in the internet. So, as I say, I was a pessimist. I was born during the bad old days, and become a double pessimist when I study political science, and become a triple pessimist now when I'm a political analyst. So, I'm sorry, I would like to applaud you two guys for being optimistic enough to do this work. If I were, I may not be able to carry myself through on all these things. And I can't add much wisdom. And although I'm not a big fan of the neocons, I always use Donald Rumsfeld's words, the known, unknown thing. Rakhine is coming from known, unknown to unknown thing. That's the biggest danger, and do people realize that? I don't know. Thank you.
Thank you, Tin. And just for the benefit of maybe some in the audience who, this 135 ethnic, is it races? Does it translate? National races in Myanmar. So a lot of these Muslims, quite a few Muslim, what do you call them, strains, Kaman, etc., are on the list. So they have a certain, I would have thought actually, Tin, that gives them a certain level of, even though there's some discomfort and fear, that if you're on that list, you kind of belong. You don't have to worry that you're going to end up like a Rohingya.
The trouble is the list changes, and there is no official list. There was a list used in certain censuses. You go back to the British census of 1931 rather, and you eliminate all the obvious foreigners, Chinese, Vietnamese, Malays, and just concentrate on the indigenous Burmese, you get 135. So somebody stuck that number in their head and said, okay, we had 135 national races. And then somebody asked General Maung in 1989, what are the 135 national races? He said, I don't know, somebody just told me there's that many. So then they made up a list. And then they had to make up another list, because they lost the other one. And it keeps changing. Now, if you look at the list of 135 national races, quote unquote, about 60 of them are in the Chin state, which has also the smallest population. Basically, every village in the Chin state is linguistically unseparate from the next village because there's another mountaintop away. And it's a different nation, a different race. It's nonsense. But all this ethnicity stuff is nonsense. But it's hard to get, as Tin said, to getting someone to understand this nonsense. When we're all told by our mother we're something, we're told who our father is too, by our mother. We really don't know. And we grow up being told, you're this, you're this, you're this, you're this, you're this. And if you don't believe it, you're telling your mother that she's a liar. No one can tell her mother she's a liar, because she was told all this stuff. And so we're stuck with it. And until we can wipe out the human memory, things are not going to get any better.
Yeah.
So at least they're going to try.
Thanks for that context. I think it's really...
Sorry, and just to add to that context, the Myanmar citizenship laws make a lot of this ethnic national race or national race in the sense that those who are of a national race are entitled to citizenship based on being a Dainta, being a national race person, as opposed to those who aren't on that list. And their ancestry may go back 100 or hundreds of years in the country, they can apply for citizenship, but more like the kind of naturalisation processes that we have in Australia, and there are different rules, so there are different classes of citizenship in the sense of the rights they have and the possibility of that being denied, and what happens to your children. Are they automatically granted citizenship, or do they have to apply when they're 18, etc.? So that's really quite at the core of the issue, yeah.
You gave a very good presentation about the internal problems in that area. And who is interested in stirring up the problems there from the outside? You mentioned some insurgents there, some fighting, so there are guns. Who supplies the guns and who supplies the money for that, and which outside power or powers have interest in destabilizing that area?
There are persistent rumours that mostly have been shown to be fairly weak of outside support for the Muslims going back decades, and that's often driven some of the fear of the military about the Muslims. having said that, there's growing evidence that Al-Qaeda and others are attempting recruitment, have set up small operations in the camps in Bangladesh, etc. But they've been attempting to recruit the Muslims, the Rohingya, into those kind of broader global, jihadic kind of movements for a long time, and they've actually been very minimal, if any, recruitment into those global Muslim or Islamist groups, despite the degree of poverty and the degree of oppression. I would characterise the Muslims as the Rohingya as being a very peace-loving people, actually, and that this recourse to violence seems to have been very much a local response, in the same way the Kachin and the Korean and other groups have responded to their perceived oppression, or to their oppression, rather than being external support. There are a few external links, and there's reports of soldiers or of people from Bangladesh and elsewhere being turned up dead in the military operations, but they don't seem to be at the helm or driving it beyond the key leadership of ASA, who are of Rohingya descent, but lived externally and grew up externally as part of the Rohingya diaspora community. So it still seems to be a Rohingya response, drawing on what links they have rather than being a foreign power behind it.
Right, but of course it's fundamental to the military and some government narratives that they are protecting the country from an external threat. So the more you can say,
just very quickly.
Yeah, very
Well, potentially one of the suppliers of we don't know for how many guns we're talking about. They're not such a huge stockpile of guns. But even we accept that there are some, I would dare to suggest that the Burmese, the Tatmadaw, provided them with guns. How? In 2016, when they made the attacks, they were using slingshots. And they attacked some military stations and they stole guns. And then in 2017, they appeared with guns. So some of them, not all of them, maybe by the Tatmadaw, because they stole them, simply, without any external involvement. But even if we talk about external involvement in the trade of light arms, especially in that part of the world, I don't think it's very difficult to get hold of light arms in a region where we have how many more than 50 armed rebel groups at the moment? More than 20. So at the very individual level, this transaction may happen with light arms. So it's not very difficult to get.
So there's a lot of energy going into trying to trace the trail to Pakistan and fundamentalists in Saudi Arabia, etc. And there does seem to be some evidence of ASA links, but the physical transfer of arms is, as Costas said, they're pretty crude arms. I think they're a bit more than slingshots, but...
Well, the first attacks were more slingshot knives, very few weapons. In the
sharpened bamboo sticks.
My name is Haji Ismail. I'm a Rohingya.
Right.
I love my country, so this is my flag. I was born in Myanmar, Butidong Township. My my grandfather also for generation. We have very strong document of the nationality of Myanmar. In my birth certificate, also written by Burmese language. This is official document. This is in my bag. I'm a Rohingya. The Burmese government organized, accept us as a Rohingya, the Burmese ethnic group, one of ethnic group. And I have also many strong evidence what I saw with my eyes, what I heard with my ear. So no need another evidence and document to share. Inside of my body also a strong evidence how the Burmese army killing us day by day from 1962 still today. So I would like to say all of you that this is genocide, not only ethnic cleansing, but also this is genocide 100%. Before now, we Rohingya living in northern Rakhine, nearly 4 million people, pushed by Burmese army government, slowly now only remaining only 400,000 people. This is finished genocide, end of genocide.
And so, could you ask a question?
Yes,
Your
yes.
question,
My question is,
please.
in this room, thank you so much, all of your speaker. I heard from you that why did ARSA attack immediately after the Annan report was made public? So I would like to share you that it is very important for understanding what is ARSA, who is behind of ARSA.
Right.
We don't understand about ARSA. We are cheering ARSA. So I would like to say my question is, please try to understand what is ARSA. In this room, anybody know about ARSA or not? This is my question. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Would any of you like to?
Look, I think the one thing I would like to say, and I hope maybe some others want to hop in on this as well, and that is that it's so easy to talk about the Rohingya as if they are one group of people, or about the Rakhine as if all Rakhine think the same way, and they're unified, almost like an individual as an actor. And, you know, as I said before, I think in my experience, most Rohingya are very peace-loving, and I think the evidence is there that they have been one of the most tolerant people groups in Myanmar, despite the enormous marginalisation and persecution they've suffered. The fact that some have potentially, you know, some have turned to violence as a recourse is understandable, but that does not in any way implicate the whole people group. And I think we do need to recognise that it is actors and individuals and organisations, not ethnicities, that go to fight, even in a conflict that is characterised as being about ethnicity. It's organisations and groups, and most don't turn to violence, and that's really an important distinction to make.
Yeah, I think that's an absolutely central point, and in this case, a very, very small actions of a very small number have lumped more than 1 million people into the same category. So it's one of the big misconceptions.
A question about a possible comparison and lessons to be learned from the 1990-91 expulsion, from the 1991 expulsion and then repatriation in 93-94, which, without being an expert, seemed to stabilize the situation, at least for the subsequent 20 years or so, to what the lessons are, what are the faults that have been, the mistakes that have been done, and what could be drawn as conclusions or recommendations for the current situation.
I suspect Bob will have more to say on this than me, but let me just simply say that that was an incredibly different situation than now, in that a military government and not in the international spotlight, and without the same drive or agenda globally as well as by the Muslims themselves to include not just the repatriation and safety, but citizenship and recognition of citizenship in the return. So there's a lot of things that are vastly different. It wasn't a major international NGO response. There wasn't all of the international funding drives around that at that time. So I would say that there's an enormous difference that makes it very hard to actually reproduce that kind of an outcome, unfortunately. Bob? Or anyone else?
Well, as Anthony says, the 94 situation was politically very different than now, with the army government making the decisions, and they could do it without it being in the public light very much. What changed, and I suppose, after about 2012, 2013, after the elections and the government became democratic, was outlined in a paper written by former Colonel Ye Tut former Minister of Information in Myanmar, who described how, this was published at ISEAS a few years ago, you can get it on the internet, that listening to the international community led to the problems that we face today. Now, how does this curious thing play out? Well, Myanmar government was under a lot of pressure from the UN and from other agencies, aid agencies and the like in the West, to remove the immigration authorities and the intelligence people who had infiltrated and lived in the areas, Buthidown and Maung and northern Rathidown, and had contacts with village headmen, religious leaders, etc., sometimes subsidized them from military funds or from immigration department funds, etc., and had a whole network by which they could understand and control, quote unquote, the community. Well, they disbanded these organizations in about 2012, 2013, 2014. And then the government and the army became blind, as it were, and deaf to what was happening in the community. And this is what made it possible for even a small organization like ARSA to get itself involved and going without the government being aware of it. Previously, the government would try to cap such things. One of the things that differentiates most recent problem and the 78 and the 91, 92 problem was the involvement of armed groups. The other times, these people fled across the border. They were defenseless and they had nothing else they could do, they felt. And of course, this is a highly mobile community which lives off rumors. They don't live off news, they live off rumors. And the rumors ran through the community and they ran. Well, here we had a situation where similarly rumors were rife, but also some people were organized and had guns and could cause a very small rupture to explode. And that's what I think the big difference between then and now.
Can I also just venture out, in my reporting, I constantly came up with, on the Tatmadaw government side, there is this sense that, well, government, not meaning NLD, but officials that were previously involved, that there is huge regret about that 1992 agreement. And in fact, I think the Commander-in-Chief is on record saying that it won't happen again, that they feel it was a huge mistake to agree to accept back the Rohingya in the form that they did. So they are absolutely determined not to make what they see as the same mistake, and which I think has been the whole stumbling block to the negotiations for repatriation.
My name is Teza. I'm from Myanmar. So I would like to ask the question. It's the Myanmar started the democratization process since 2010. So after 2015, Lenin won a landslide by NLD. So it's a turning point for democratic transition. So after this Rohingya issue, so we worry about the backward of democratization in Myanmar, because we have we see some event that support the people support to military for this issue. So demonstration in Yangon or any some capitals, around more than 3,000 or 5,000 people involved to support the military. So we are trying to, even though Myanmar's democratization process, the military stay involved in politics constitutionally, democratic forces are trying to expand the space of civilian government and downsides of the military space. But after this issue, so, even the people support to military again to take action on this issue. This is not a good sign for democratization and to space for civilian government. So as Myanmar, we worry about this issue for the backward of democratization after this issue. And even in currently international community focus mostly on the Rohingya issue and criticizing even to the Daw San Suu Kyi de facto leader not to take action actively on the Rohingya issue. So I would like to hear about your opinion on this issue or effect or implication on the democratization process of Myanmar.
I think that I will put forward an anecdotal that we experienced with Anthony when we were doing our fieldwork. And we note that in the book as well. despite the optimism about, because we did our field work around 2014, 2016, despite the optimism about democratization and the push for human rights, etc., we were talking to people what we would brand as the progressive forces of Myanmar, and they were not interested to talk about the Rohingya at all. The Rohingya were out of the democratization process. They were not part of it. Even people who are working for human rights agencies explicitly said to us that we would prefer them to go. And this is within inverted commas, so this is the quote. Local human rights activists. So, and this is really paradoxical in the sense that you have in front of you people who talk about human rights, who are fervent supporters of democracy, they want to push the country forward, but when it comes to this thorny issue of the Rohingya, they turn their head the other way. And that generates questions. Why this is happening? So in the context of the democratization process slowing down at the moment for a number of reasons, I'm not very optimistic about the impact of this slowing down to the Rohingya issue at all. And this is one of the issues that it has to be addressed by the progressive forces. So they have to be really progressive. So they have to embrace everyone when it comes to human rights.
Thank you. Do either of you gentlemen want to say anything on this issue of democratization?
I would just add to that. One of the few things that Daw San Suu Kyi once said when she was asked about the crisis in Rakhine, are they Myanmar people? Of course, the unanswered question was they're not, so it's not a problem. I want to look at the international aspect of this. It creates a great dilemma for those governments which have been trying to encourage the democratization of Myanmar, what to do in this dilemma, because they're quite aware of the public opinion that you noted in your comment. And this creates a dilemma for them and for the UN and others who are trying to encourage the growth of democratic institutions in Myanmar, to try to drive the army out of the great power that it holds. In other words, without querying the progress that's been made since 2011, 2012 in democratization. At the same time as championing the rights, human rights, etc., of the Rohingya. And this creates a great dilemma for Western governments. And you can see this in the sort of ways they twist their words sometimes when they're talking about Myanmar these days. So, the push from many political people in the West is for sanctions, and governments have been resisting this by and large up until now, because they see them as being counterproductive for the larger project that they have. And the Rohingya are sort of caught in the middle.
Well, this kind of apparent popularity of the army in the case of the Rohingya suppression is not new, because in 2014, I think, when there was a big war in Kogan, in Laokai, when the army was up against rebels who are actually, I'm sorry to use the word, ethnic Chinese by origin, and supposedly supplied by Chinese arms, and mauled the army in the first wave of attacks. The people were very pro-army then also. So the army also framed it in a way of national sovereignty issue, although not mentioning China, of course. So this is also, army framed it as a national sovereignty and territorial integrity issue. And that falls easily into the psyche of many Burmans, in a way. Intellectuals, Western educated, across the board. You ask them, they come up with the same answer. It's better that they not come back. I mean, that's the kind of answer you get. It's better that they not come back. That's the kind of answer you get if you don't tell them, if you know them enough to ask that question. They will not do it publicly.
Right.
Good riddance. So even repatriation is going to be a real problem. Not talking about citizenship or resolution of the crisis. And no elected government can go against that. Even the military government at the time couldn't go against that in such a way, not so much directly. So this is the problem of democratization, opening up the Pandora box. I'm not saying right or wrong, value judgment, normative anyway. It's part of the process of transformation of the country in which there are so many peoples with grudges, and they do not want to share the wealth. If there is wealth, I doubt it. And then it gets, when you talk about economics, I mean, the Rakhines are very adamant about their economic rights, that all the natural gases offshore belongs to them. The state should not take any of them, not a percentage. So, I mean, this is kind of thinking, the Shans were saying that too. So I asked them, what about the Chins, which have nothing except mud and drats? So, I mean, the idea of federal union will be bogged down again by all these things again. And this is just one illustration of the kind of divisions. So it's called diversity. I sometimes call it a problem of the failure of management of diversity, which is a kind of just making it a little bit innocuous. Right. But diversity is not accepted by the Burmese themselves. That's the problem.
Well, I only have the 1 million question, $1 million question, which is, do you think really that the repatriation scheme can work? And in case you think it cannot work, which would be the likeliest outcome or the more realistic alternative?
I think that the best we could hope for in the next 12 months or even 2 years would be maybe 50,000 or 100,000 return, or something fairly tokenistic and minimal. The optimist in me would like to think that maybe a few 100,000 could come back, but I don't see a mechanism or a pathway or the conditions at the moment for 1 million, let alone even a wider diaspora than that, to be welcomed back or to be allowed back in any sort of circumstances. So. But that said, I think it is really important that as an international community we do everything we can to facilitate as much as can be achieved. A couple of 100,000 back in the next couple of years would actually be a major, I mean, even getting the agreement signed a few weeks ago around the repatriation.
You mean the MOU with
the MOU,
between
yes.
the Myanmar government, the UN, and
exactly, the UNHCR and UNICEF. Around repatriation and some of the provisions. I mean, it's been leaked and presumably we're seeing a real draft of it. Some of the provisions in there go beyond what people might have anticipated. So I think we need to keep the pressure up and keep working towards it. But realistically, a couple of 100,000 would be almost a dream outcome.
Okay, so we've got one answer, which is it can be 20% successful. Anyone else have an odds on that?
One indication is that
that's the optimist talking.
One indication is that another example is that there are over 120,000 or so of refugees in Thailand along the border, mostly Karens, Shans, and so on. They were results of the other campaigns in the military since 82, 83. I think about 100,000 or 200,000 were sent to third country placements. And the government, democratic government, said that they want them to come back. And there was some sort of understanding between the Thai government and the Myanmar government. If I am not wrong, only a few hundred has come back. So that is, they are citizens. The government accepted them as citizens, as ethnic nationalities, not like Rohingya. So how difficult that kind of repatriation can be. And they don't want to come back. And you ask the camps, they said they don't want to come back unless this. Mind you, in Myanmar, nobody owns land. The state owns the land. It's the right to work. That is the issue. And some of the neglected areas, the state don't care, so they can sort of claim own land, do farm things. But theoretically, the state owns all the land, in everything, not only land.
Right.
So it is a lease. And given the new laws, of course, you can transfer the rights and so on for those Burmese nationals in a farmer's thing. But in the case of when you say the Rohingya want to come back and get their land, and that's also another problem. Come back to your original villages. That was the original idea. That is also problematic. There are no more villages in that area physically. And the Rakhine doesn't want them to be near them. So it will be a huge segregated community again if they come back. So what do? Another joke. You have a segregated community, let them come back, put a wall and a minefield in between, and let the UN take care of them. That's a joke.
But on that note, can I just point out that at this stage it would seem that virtually all of southern half of Maung township is vacated, and the plans that I've seen thus far around repatriation are all to bring Muslims back into northern Maung, which is nicely isolated from the rest of the country to a greater extent, almost with a buffer zone. So I've got no privy information, just what's out there, but I do note that southern Maung at the moment seems to be being kept free of Muslims, free of anybody in fact, because Rakhine are being moved off it as well.
Right, and if it's any measure, the social welfare minister in Myanmar, who's in charge of the government repatriation kind of committee or effort, estimated to us that they could comfortably bring back 100 a week. So that's 400 a month, and if you've got like 1 million refugees, actually this effort's going to take many decades. So, you know, even if they step it up, I think it's pretty unrealistic to, yeah, your estimate is about the most you could. No, I wasn't going to say wild. Anyway, I think that concludes it's been excellent. I think we've really sort of had some very good presentations, and you've brought great insights, and our discussants have been superb, if not pessimistic. Would you like to say anything, Bob? No, I think it's a lovely confluence of pessimists, optimists, and pragmatists. Sorry. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming, and thank you to the panelists.